The End of Death, Part 1. Death rode along a river of shadow, wisps of black mist lifting with each pull of his oar. A little girl sat opposite him. She had felt worried at first, but as Death spoke and rode, both as gentle as an evening's tide, she found herself relaxing. The child peered over the edge, seeing white figures in the dark undertow. One jumped up and out, splashing specks of pure light against her pale skin. She giggled. "Not too close to the edge, my child," rumbled the warm voice that was Death. "I'd rather not go in after you. This rope is nigh impossible to try." The child laughed again. The man was dressed in stark black to contrast her own white gown. It was baggy and seemed soft to the touch, though she still felt too nervous to do so. "Mr. Death?" came her small voice in a questioning tone. "Yes, my child," Death replied, his own voice shaking the narrow wooden craft. "Where are we going?" Death pondered for a moment. "It is a place where you will be everyone you ever were. Does that help?" "No." "I suppose not. Death rarely spoke to his charges. Few had the capacity to do more than sit in silence. He relished passengers like this. "It is a place where you will find everyone you've known. You will all arrive there at the same time and... I suppose all that you need know is that you'll be fine. You'll be happy there," he said with a smile. It was a warm smile. His eyes were so bright and blue, a strong contrast to the gaunt figure. Another light jumped out of the shimmering black and splashed back in, like a shooting star an arm's width away. "Okay," replied the girl. Not much expression in the word, but she seemed a little more at ease. "Are you coming, Mr. Death?" she continued. "Me? Oh no. Perhaps when there are no others left to ferry, but for now, someone must row the boat." "Oh, that's too bad. What about your friends?" she asked. Death laughed at that, a full-bellied laugh that slowed the boat until he regained his composure. "No friends, I'm afraid. Plenty of brothers and sisters, many of whom you may meet on the other side. But no friends." "Why?" asked the little girl. Death sighed. Part 2. This had been planned. It had taken a long time. For a mortal, that means years or even decades. But for the gods, that waited in the twists and tangles aside the shore, it meant eons. Ages had come and gone as the siblings of Death schemed. Whispers in grand halls and bargains in the lowliest alleys. Anywhere two gods met, the name of Death was sure to rise. "He does nothing with his power but pander to these insects. He is not worthy to wield it," Agorok had said. A beast of a man who could shatter mountains with swings of his mighty mace. The spiked ball was crusted with the blood of titans and angels from millennia past. Now, it hungered for fratricide. "The mortals should love us again, lay their lips at our feet as they once did. Now they barely remember our names." The porcelain-skinned Alara had growled in a voice like honey-dipped thorns. Now she hid with a dozen daggers at the waist, tightly bound in leathers and dark grease that allowed her to blend into the branches around her. Trees overgrew the bank, as lightless as the waters they drank, the perfect place to hide vengeful gods. Half a dozen eyes peered out of them at the nearing vessel, at that mighty deity, at that force of nature that had been born with the universe, at the selfish miser that cared not for the plight of his family.
"A change is needed. More of us fade each day,"
rationalized the deep thrum of Auron, black skin and white hair that looked like a lion's mane.
"I love our brother, but if he will not see reason, then action must be taken,"
he had said all those years ago. Now he sat in the dark among knots of wood and mud that caked his boots. In his day, he had worn splendid armour that shone so brightly, the sun wept tears of gold in envy. His hammer had shattered valleys in the earth, and he had rested in their shade, bathed in the worship of men. In this place, dressed like a common highwayman, his shame broke through all his reason, and he felt the urge to weep. "Fuck him!" the bold and grey-hearted spat when they entreated his aid. Flesh as cold as his name, and scars marred upon every inch. All that schemer had needed was the offer, and he was eager to wet his arrow with the blood of death. A scrawny man, he had not even needed to change his attire. His drab clothes made him near invisible amidst the winding trunks. He licked his lips and notched. Soon the power would be his.
It's what's right. It's what must be done. If we do not slay Death and take his strength, every last one of us will perish,
said Matilda, puffy red hair and robust of build. When she was given the offer, she continually nodded her head, as though trying to convince herself she was in the right.
I am not happy about it, but we've asked time and time again, only to be rejected,
she had bemoaned. Now she sat in the trees, trying desperately not to muddy her dress. It had been hard enough to get her to shed the bright gown in place of something more subtle. Alkesh did not rationalize. He did not reason or entreat. He did not even hate, really. A brown-skinned man, fit but not some grand hero like Agarok. Pleasant features, but not a great beauty like his sister Alara. No one had approached Alkesh, for this plan had been his. And plan he had. Alkesh had gone over and over again what needed to be done. When, where, who. New gods, old gods, demigods, and beasts. This was a plan that touched all. Many who might have disputed his work had been silenced, either by bribe or by blade. Now it was here. Agarok, Alara, Auron, Greyheart, Matilda, and himself. 6 of the most cunning and fearsome, the most powerful gods of every age that had come and passed. A plan perfectly organised to the last breath, all to destroy this doddering fool who even now was laughing and rowing his silly boat for his silly little humans. Each of his siblings had boasted and bragged about how they would be the one to finish him, even Honourable Auron, eager to get the first taste of his freed power. All would perish. They had to do it right. Carefree and foolhardy as death may be, this being was old when they had yet to appear in the minds of men. Death rode slowly. Push, pull, push, pull. They could not underestimate him. Part 3. Well, child, Death pondered, all must cross this river eventually. And most are not as pleasant company as you, he said, leaning forward to ruffle her long, blonde hair with a bony hand that was surprisingly soft and warm. The girl giggled. Any time someone comes to chat, it's only about what they want, how I can help them, how I should do away with these little journeys and commit to something that matters. Alas, I'm happy rowing my boat. I leave the affairs of gods and mortals to themselves, until their ends, of course, explained Death. The little girl's attention was back on the waters. She dipped her hand inside the smoke, and it fell through her fingers. Death continued to speak, mostly to himself, though the disinterested nodding of the child was still a comfort to his usually lonely monologue. They beg and plead and bargain. They shout and rage and strike at me. But they're all more than happy for the boat when it comes their turn to ride in it, he sneered. His frustration morphed into exasperation with a sigh. They don't understand, breathed the robed man. He scratched at his hair, a full head of brown locks, but thin and wiry like his stubble. When I tell them that they cannot have what I possess, it is not because I hoard it. What need have I of such power? No, I just don't want them to have it. The pain it would cause, not just to the mortals, but to themselves. It would tear them... Don't drink that! Death snapped. Sorry, said the child as she uncupped her hand and allowed the thick mist to flow out. Death chuckled at the girl's guilty expression, and the pair sat in silence for a span, the only sound coming from his gentle paddling through the stream. The child spoke again. Kind of like how I wouldn't give my little brother a sweet the other day. He cried, and Mummy told me not to be selfish, but I wasn't being selfish. I didn't want it to get stuck, since he's so little and sometimes his food gets stuck. Death tilted his head.
Yes, exactly like that. Very observant, child.
He nodded. My name's Emma.
They would choke on the power,
Death continued, as though he had not heard, mind occupied by the analogy.
They would choke the humans, themselves, one another. I'm not here to use what was given me. My task is simply to hold it, to contain it as I do my duty, until I need do it no longer.
Sounds boring, Emma said. Death grinned, never tiring of the honesty of youth.
Some days it is,
Death admitted with a shrug.
Some days my passengers just sit in silence, too anxious to provide pleasant company.
Death looked at Emma out of the corner of his eye.
And sometimes my passengers are mischievous little girls who try to steal the Neverborn from the River of Waiting.
Death gave the child a levelled expression and held out his hand to her. She unclenched a fist, and a little silver tadpole fell into the outstretched fingers of the boatman. He moved it over the edge and allowed it to flop back into the depths of the shadow, swimming away enthusiastically. Death smiled and got back to his rowing.
Yes, some days are less entertaining than others, but it's all worth it.
Why? Asked Emma.
For the stories, my child,
he said with glee.
My brothers and sisters are like me. We are what we are, and what we always have been.
A hint of longing edged his words.
They judge your kind, thinking mortals too fleeting to be of importance. But that's why you matter,
he said with a beaming smile, infectious enough to make Emma return the expression.
So full of life and potential and choice,
continued Death. He sighed then.
That's what my family can never understand. That's why I can't help them. They long for the old days, before man ruled man. I do not. There were no stories in those days. Souls came and went, but their only purpose was to serve. This boat has always carried mortals and immortals alike. But back then, it was empty.
Part 4. Soon now, death was almost upon them. Alkesh breathed heavy, but calm. He would walk this child onto the bank where they waited. They would spring from the trees. They would have him. Groups of luminous Neverborn leapt from the flowing surface of the smoke, before landing with a splash like the rushing of wind. Swish, splash, swish, splash, swish, splash. It had been planned. Oren would strike his mighty hammer the moment Death lay foot upon the bank, causing the mud to rise around his leg, holding him tight and testing his balance. The sound of Oren's steel on earth was the conductor to Matilda's symphony. She would bellow a tune tailored to Death's ears, a song to lull him into a paralytic bliss. Then Alara would strike. The raven-haired devil whose bright eyes deceived the cold heart beneath. Her daggers from one side, as Greyheart let fly from the other. Neither had ever missed, but Alkesh would take no chances. Bound by earth, bleeding and entranced, Death would be helpless against Agarok's attack. The Goliath would charge and lay his mace upon the eldest of their siblings. As for Alkesh, he was not one to fight. His power was the art of control, to channel and hold what was left of their lost brother. It was tough to convince his petty siblings to trust him, but they had little choice. Regardless of how powerful they were, in a few ages, they too would fade like all the others. They just had to trust Alkesh to be merciful and share once the power was his. He was here. The creaky boat hitting the bank as the little girl grasped at the Neverborn off the rear. Agarok held firm his mace. Alara looked dead ahead at her target. Oren raised his hammer. Greyheart drew. Matilda took a deep breath, and Alkesh began to draw power from within and without. A flowing ball of transparent energy grew between his hands. He poured himself into it. He would need all his strength to contain his brothers. Death tied the boat onto a hanging branch and turned to his charge. Part 5. Death looked at little Emma, who kneeled over the edge, distracted by the jumping lights. Swish, splash. He smiled. Death would find this one again, he was sure of it. He had made many friends over the eons and planned on visiting them all when he was finally able to dock the boat for the last time. He heard the child continuing to play behind him as he raised a leg to leave the vessel. Swish, splash, swish, splash. His foot came over the edge. Swish, splash, swish, splash, swish, splash. He placed it on the muddy floor. Swish. The crash of a hammer. Death was in the air, spinning away from grasping tendrils of earth. Robes billowed, and an angelic tone echoed throughout the forest, but Death's arms were crossed, a palm on each ear. A flurry of daggers came from his left, narrowly missing him as he danced through the air. One of the blades found his foot, and was sent hurtling towards the darkness. The singing stopped in a gurgle. Hands free, Death clapped around the shaft of an arrow as he landed. Greyheart looked on in wide-eyed wonder as Agarok's surprise turned into fury mid-charge. The giant screamed, bringing his mace down on the frail-looking man, only to find the arrow pinning his jaw to its roof, the shaft embedded firmly in his brain. Agarok's mace dropped into Death's waiting hand and was sent flying in the next instant, crushing Greyheart's head against the oily bark of a twisted tree trunk before the scarred man could draw again. The last thing the archers saw was Alara's next volley going straight over a crouching Death and into a fumbling Orin who had come forward in a panic. Alkesh saw no way out. Plan in pieces like his siblings around him, he threw the orb, threw all the power he could muster. Death swatted it like an annoying fly. The invisible force flew to the side and slit Alara's slender neck. She fell, grasping at her gushing wound. Splash. Emma turned from the Neverborn with a confused expression. She could see little in the darkness of the forest, and even now the bodies littering the earth began to smoke and fade to nothing. Death's siblings returning to the far bank, where he would help them make this same journey. Ready to go? Death asked the girl, hand proffered to help her out of the boat. Are you coming? She asked hesitantly. I can take you to the door if you'd like, but it's not my time to walk through it just yet, Death told her. At her worried expression, he continued. Don't fret. We all arrive there the same. I'll be waiting on the other side. Emma seemed confused, but she lifted her arms and allowed Death to carry her off the boat. He took her hand, and they began to walk through the decaying corpses of his brethren. Emma seemed not to notice, until they crossed Alkesh, who looked up with trembling hands and tears in his eyes. Who's that? Asked Emma. Death gazed down at the sad sight. Now empty of power, Alkesh looked up and awaited judgment from this ancient being. That's my brother. Death spoke without anger or even disappointment. He simply looked sad. You shouldn't cry, Mr. Death's brother, said Emma. All our friends are waiting. She smiled. She patted his head with a small hand. Alkesh stopped sniffling. I hope you find a nice story, Death told him, still without a hint of malice. He gave a nod to Emma, and she said goodbye. She lifted her hand to Death, allowing him to lead her through the dark forest and into the light.